Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Good. Okay, well, it's a great privilege then to welcome Professor Jeffrey Schloss, who I'm sure many of you have been meeting already over the course of this weekend. Jeff is the chair of biology at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. He's also very much involved in the whole science and religion discussion in the context of evolutionary biology. He's got a whole list of books. I won't even start to read them here. Some are published by Oxford University Press. And he's been particularly involved in this whole area of altruism and how far do we go with evolutionary theories for cognitive psychology in that whole area. I know that he's debated quite a few times on radio, perhaps television as well, with Dan Dennett and people like that over the past year or so. And so he's very experienced, ready to come and talk to us on the topic which is not up on the screen, which is on your programs, Does Biology Explain Religion? And I think Jeff's got an even slightly longer title now. So thank you very much, Jeff. Over to you.
Fabulous to be here with you this morning. I want to discuss with you the emergence of recent evolutionary theories of religious belief itself. And I'm struck by two things in beginning. First of all, I really think we talk a lot about science and religion. We're beginning now to get into the science of religion. And this may be the single most important topic in terms of how the sciences relate to religion. I'm mindful of the fact that this is a diverse group. Some of you are coming with your own religious faith, endeavoring to make sense of scientific issues. Some of you are just interested academically in these issues. Some actually are doing scholarship, some are neophytes. I'm going to try to honor the diversity of the group here. It's no news to any of us that these issues have exploded really into the mainstream by a number of provocative and prominent popularizations. But really the science of religion, at least from an evolutionary perspective, is a relatively recent enterprise. And here in Cambridge, I'm mindful of a comment that C.S. Lewis made right here about 50 years ago in his inaugural lecture for a chair here. Lewis says, the sciences, speaking of the 17th and 18th century, the scientists long remained like a lion cub whose gambols delighted its master in private. It had not yet tasted man's blood. Science was not the business of man because man had not yet become the business of science. But when Darwin starts monkeying with the ancestry of man, Freud with his soul, then indeed the lion will have got out of the cage.
Wonderful.
Yeah, interestingly, I think Lewis may have anticipated, but it had not yet happened, that in a sense the lion actually attacked and not just got out of the cage. The heretofore off-limits issue of religion. Mary Midgley makes the comment that over the last several decades we've seen the breakdown of a precarious truce. A truce that involved the agreement between evolutionary theorists and social and human scientists, in which the latter agreed never to question the truth of evolutionary theory so long as Darwinists never attempted to make any serious use of it. And of course that has eroded with the eruption of sociobiology and the formal application of evolutionary theory, not just to animal behavior but to human behavior as well. It's generated a tremendous amount of public attention. And on the one hand, maybe there are pointers toward God here. For those who have faith in God and who believe that we're embodied creatures, the sciences may illuminate not just the handiwork of God, but the ways in which we're made for God. And on the other hand, there are genuine challenges here. So you've already seen this cover from Time magazine once already. In his recent book, Dan Dennett, Breaking the Spell, talks of pioneers who are now beginning, for the first time really, to study the natural phenomenon of religion through the eyes of contemporary science. Now, if ignoring perhaps the slightly self-congratulatory tone of this phrase, we might ask, well, really, what is happening for the first time? Over 200 years ago, Hume, in his dialogue, Natural History of Religion, made the comment, as every inquiry which regards religion is of the utmost importance, there are two questions in particular which challenge our attention. To wit, that concerning its foundation in reason, and that concerning its origin in human nature. Now, these two issues here, its foundation in reason and its origin in human nature, I want to consider as Hume's two questions. And that first question, its foundation in reason, is the question of evidence for belief. And that's the question which Hume took up earlier in his dialogues concerning natural religion. And this is an ancient area of inquiry. It, in fact, is the tradition of skepticism, or within the context of professing belief, the tradition of evidential apologetics. And it's a long tradition. There's nothing new here. It's a tradition that extends at least from Epicurus all the way to Hume and to the present day. And within the community of faith, it also exists as well. There have been skeptics of the value of evidential apologetics in the Christian faith. One of my favorite thinkers is Pascal, but you see the same thing in Kierkegaard and many of the neo-Orthodox thinkers. So there's little new here. What is new? What is Dennett and the other evolutionary theorists of religion claiming are new? What's new is the focus on Hume's second question, and the enthusiastic, vigorous focus, not on the evidence for belief, but on the causes of belief. And to steal a phrase from Paul Ricoeur here, we might consider this not the tradition of skepticism, but the hermeneutic of suspicion. It doesn't ask what the reasons or evidence are for people's beliefs, but what the underlying motives or causes are. So it focuses exclusively on biological, social, psychological, or the social origin of beliefs, without many times considering whether the beliefs actually might be true or false. Now, in one sense, that makes sense, because the natural sciences are disciplines that look for the causes of things and don't evaluate metaphysical arguments. But there's probably something deeper at work going on here. And what's going on that is deeper at work is the erosion of confidence, or even a sense of plausibility for many religious beliefs. So I think Kai Nielsen, the philosopher, typifies this when he says, "By now it has been well established that there are no sound reasons for religious belief. There's no reasonable possibility of establishing religious beliefs to be true. There's no such thing as religious knowledge or sound religious belief. But when there are no good reasons for religious belief, and yet religious belief persists in our cultural life, then it's time to look for the causes." So, one of the things that has happened, and many of this doesn't make their ideas wrong, by the way, nor does it make them unvaluable. They may be immensely valuable. But one of the things that has happened is that all that's left is to look for the causes. Secondly, it's one thing to say that the evidences for religious belief aren't good, and what we need to do is to look for causes. But the other thing that's going on is a reduction of the former into the latter. That is to say, why would people even think there are causes or evidences for religious belief? And there's been a collapse in the field of cognitive evolutionary psychology to explain why we think what we think, particularly in the area of religion and morals, in terms of underlying Darwinian mechanisms. So, for example, Dan Dennett, again, in Breaking the Spell, says, everything we value, from sugar and sex and money to music and love and religion, we value for reasons. But lying behind and distinct from our reasons are evolutionary reasons, free-floating rationales that have been endorsed by natural selection. By the way, I'm a Christian believer and an evolutionary biologist, and I believe this. The question is, to what extent are human reasons fully constrained by evolutionary reasons? If I were to put this in the language of game theory, it would be, to what extent are human utilities, psychological utilities, reducible to selection's utilities? Now, that's a question that's still open. It's not just a question, an issue of debate between science and religion, but and within the natural sciences themselves, there is debate over this issue. Earlier, Michael Roos mentioned E.O. Wilson's seminal launching of sociobiology 31 years ago now. In that book, Wilson provocatively talks about the origin of morality and religious beliefs, and he says they evolved by natural selection. That simple biological statement must be pursued to explain ethics and ethical philosophers, if not epistemology and epistemologists, at all depths. So that's the second aspect of what's new here, really an ambitious reductionism. And by the way, again, the game of science is to get as far as you can with an idea. So there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't mean that from the start, Dennett distinguishes greedy reductionism from appropriate reductionism. Greedy reductionism insists from the start that its tool has to solve everything. And lastly, the last thing that's new is the equating of organic rootedness or function with origin. That is to say, the confidence that if we find a root in human nature of belief, that describes its ultimate origin. Now, of course, there's a metaphysical question here. Just because we find the root of something, does that mean that's its ultimate origin? But there's also a scientific question, a straightforward question of evolutionary science. For example, just because we understand the function of the heart or the function of DNA doesn't mean that that's a sufficient account of their origin. In fact, we don't really have an account for the origin of DNA, although we understand very well its function. Now, Stephen Jay Gould said a number of, I think, silly things over the course of his career, but this is one point he made at the end of his career that I think is very important. He talks about a crucial but often disregarded distinction between reasons for historical origin and basis of current utility. The common conflation of these entirely separate notions has engendered enormous confusion in evolutionary theory. So we need to just keep these things in mind as we launch into where we're going here. But I do want to say that this package of these three things constitutes something that I think is genuinely is new in terms of the analysis of religion. It is claimed by many of the advocates of this approach that not only is it new, but it's completely inimical to the viability of religious faith itself. So example, Kai Nielsen again says, all naturalistic explanation is incompatible, where accepted, with the person who accepts it continuing to be a religious believer. Naturalistic explanations of religion would, if widely accepted, destroy religion itself. So one of the things that I want to do in the time remaining is, well, actually I want to do two things. I want to look at those naturalistic explanations and assess to what extent they are or are not adequate. And by the way, they may be necessary but not sufficient. They may be part of the explanatory package but still leave some things unexplained. But then secondly, also ask the question, is this true? Is naturalistic explanation indeed ultimately incompatible with continuing to be a believer? Now, Nielsen just asserts it. There are some arguments for this that we want to look at. So here we go. Our plan is to make a few comments on what it means to provide naturalistic explanations of religion, then describe the major accounts and conclude with some implications for faith. Now, at the beginning of his talk, Francis Collins mentioned that he wasn't a philosopher or a theologian. I'm not either, although I've had earnest and long-standing interest in philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. I am scandalized by the philosophical swashbuckling and naivete of many of my colleagues in biology that I think, as little as I know, I think they may know less than I do. Jerry Fodor, who is a philosopher, says of Richard Dawkins that he's a biologist who continually claims we have no use for philosophy, but inevitably ends up doing it badly. So the first question is, what does it mean to provide a natural explanation for something? And this actually is not a straightforward question. What most scientists mean, most of the time most scientists don't think about this. I suspect when Francis goes into the lab, he doesn't think, okay, I got to avoid, I got to only use natural explanations today. But recently, especially in the US, scientists have been forced by the political situation to justify and explain what about their approaches to these issues is properly scientific. And the thing that comes up again and again is what it means to provide a scientific or natural explanation is that it's not a supernatural explanation. Well, this may be true, but it isn't very helpful since supernatural means just not natural. Jerry Coyne, an evolutionary biologist at University of Chicago, just a few months ago, in response to creationism, said science simply doesn't deal with hypotheses about a guiding intelligence or supernatural phenomenon like miracles, because science is a search for rational explanations of natural phenomena. I would agree with this, by the way, although he still doesn't tell us what it means to be natural as opposed to supernatural. Steven Weinberg, the Nobel laureate, says supernaturalism is just belief in fairies. Now, that's a swipe, of course, but it's a swipe that's not a very helpful one. First of all, I don't happen to believe in fairies, but the ontology that prevails for most people who do believe in fairies is that they're actually not supernatural entities. They obey natural laws, although they're laws that most of us think simply aren't true. Furthermore, the existence of fairies has recently been empirically confirmed. That's Michael Roos. He's not here, but he deserves this. Now, Coyne himself gives a list of what he thinks represents supernatural. Alchemy, faith healing, astrology, creationism in the same article that I was just citing. I'm sympathetic to what Coyne is trying to do here, but actually I don't agree with this list. So Owen Gingrich, the historian of astronomy and the astronomer at Harvard, actually has a history of astrology. In most ages, astrology was deeply intertwined with the science of the day. In many cases, actually, it was fully naturalistic. It turns out not to be true. It's kind of in the trash heap with a number of other fully naturalistic scientific proposals that have turned out not to be true. But there's nothing supernatural about astrology. The philosopher Michael Ray comments on this. He says, we disagree about what it is for something to count as natural or supernatural. There are common paradigms. Men, beasts, plants, atoms, and electrons are natural. God, angels, ghosts, immaterial souls are supernatural. I actually agree with this list more than Coyne's. But even these paradigms are controversial. And in any case, it's not clear what the terms on each list have in common with their other list mates that makes them examples of natural or supernatural entities. I think Ray is right here, and I want to clarify, I'm not making a case here for the inclusion of supernatural in science. What I am saying is that the boundaries are ambiguous, and over the course of the history of science, and I'd love to have Ron comment on this, they've actually been permeable. There are many ideas which people poo-pooed as supernatural, which have come to be regarded as natural, and vice versa. So it's not clear that we can always a priori include a hypothesis because it's supernatural, although that's probably a good working beginning point. Now, we might just say something like, okay, in the last analysis, to provide a natural explanation, and I believe this, is to explain it in terms of observable regularities and testable causal relations. I believe that. But observable regularities, the way we formulate regularities, and the way we construe causal relations are both highly theory-laden. Alistair McGrath makes this point in several points. It's not that the world itself cries out in some sense of primal knowledge about this distinction. We develop historically a sense of what it means to distinguish the natural and the supernatural. In any case, bottom line, in terms of the study of religion, pursuing a naturalistic approach seems to mean proposing explanations of religious belief that do not employ the objects of religious belief in causal accounts of those beliefs, or their attendant affect and behaviors. That is the starting premise that scientific scholars of religion are using these days. It seems to me a fair premise. On the other hand, I want to point out it's an unusual premise. Because if I wanted to explain, for example, the reason why somebody believes in Pythagorean theorem, I would in fact use the attributes of the belief in a causal account of holding it, but not in religious belief. Now I do have to say that this doesn't assume the falsity of what is believed in. It just assumes that in a causal explanation of where the belief comes from, the truth or falsity is inert in terms of an explanation. Okay, that's one question. The second question is a question of warrant. Why is it that we pursue this naturalistic as opposed to supernaturalistic? I'm not going to say much about this, and any of these would be, long seminars in themselves. But it turns out that working evolutionary biologists have very different understandings of this. So, for example, some of them have an instrumentalist sense of warrant. We use natural explanations because they work. Jerry Coyne again says, we don't reject the supernatural merely because we have an overweening philosophical commitment to materialism. We reject it because entertaining the supernatural has never helped us understand the natural world. I happen, and again, Ron's the historian of science, but there seems to be merit to that observation. Supernatural explanations have not been fruitful in understanding the natural world. So that's one case. But, by the way, if that's our grounds for rejecting the supernatural, then would we be open to it if it did produce explanatory fruit? Well, no less a naturalist than W.V. Quine says yes. In his Naturalism, or Living Within One's Means, Quine says, if I saw indirect explanatory benefit in positing sensibilia, possibilia, spirits, a creator, I would joyfully accord them scientific status too, on a par with such avowedly scientific posits as quarks and black holes. This is an interesting debate, and Quine would seem to open the door to intelligent design theory. And by the way, Richard Dawkins claims the same thing. He said if he had been living in the 1840s, he would have been a design advocate. And if there were decent evidence now, which he claims there isn't, there would be warrant for being a design advocate now. So there's one position that says we don't rule it out a priori, it just doesn't work. But another position is, no, we rule it out a priori because of prior ontological commitments. So again, the evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin argues that this is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. So Lewontin says it's because we are materialists that we're committed to this methodology. But if that's true, by the way, if one weren't a materialist, could there be a different methodology? The philosopher Al Plantinga argues yes, and he has this notion of what he calls Augustinian or theistic science, that if you're not a materialist like Lewontin, then, and you have prior warrant for believing that God has been active, you don't pull him out of the bag every time you can't explain something. That's God of the gaps. Plantinga argues that this isn't God of the gaps. If you have prior warrant for believing that God is active, that ought to be in your explanatory bag of tricks. Now, I've pushed Al a little bit on this and said, yeah, but the whole, not the whole, but a dramatic aspect of the utility of science is that it's democratic in methodology. Everybody can participate. And that would create a separate science for Christians or for theists. And Plantinga's response is, okay, well, let's not call it science. Let's call it gobbledygook. It doesn't matter what we call it. It's a method of inquiry. I actually don't have answers to these. My point here is saying, in most areas of science, it doesn't matter. When we're proposing explanations for belief in the supernatural, these things probably matter. Lastly, at least in terms of our polygamos, there's widespread assertion that in one sense it doesn't matter. Because no matter what you think, if the religious beliefs are false, if they're true, we're not starting with a commitment to their truth or falsity. We're just starting with a commitment to see how far we can get with natural explanation. And that's neutral with respect to religious belief, and that's something that we should all be able to participate in and benefit from. So, for example, Rodney Stark, who is himself a religious believer and a scientific student of religion, says our fundamental quest is to apply social scientific tools to the relationship between human beings and what they experience as divine. Science may examine any aspect of that relationship except its authenticity. So whether or not our sense of God is true or not is not a scientific question. Dan Dennett, although he's widely caricatured in his most recent book as castigating religion, he actually has some very endearing passages in that, in Breaking the Spell. And here's one of them. Dennett is arguing for a fundamental neutrality here of the scientific study of religion. It could be true that God exists, that God is indeed the intelligent, conscious, loving creator of us all, and yet religion itself is a complex set of phenomena, is a perfectly natural phenomenon. Now, I do want to point out two differences between the Stark and the Dennett comment. Stark is just claiming that we want to get as far as we can with natural explanations of religion, and someplace we can't get is the authenticity or the viability of what the belief is. Dennett is saying it could be true that God exists, but religion is a perfectly natural phenomenon. And elsewhere he explains what he means by that. That there are no miracles, that there are no supernatural events within religion. Well, I guess it could be true that God is the creator and lover of us all, and that God chooses to do no miracles or no supernatural events. That would not be the God that most religious believers are committed to. Or, interestingly, that most scientific study students of religion want to explain belief in. So those two quotes are actually quite different. And I want to conclude this section by just saying that even this notion of neutrality is a little bit debatable. I mean, there's a case to be made for enforcing, encouraging it, and stimulating it. First of all, because for the integrity of science. Science, in principle, doesn't rule on metaphysical questions. And secondly, by the way, for the viability of the field itself. If it takes a position on religious belief, we're going to lose access to the communities that we want to study. Very much the way anthropologists would lose access to a community if they went in saying, I want to study why you believe these ridiculous things. So there's a case to be made for neutrality. On the other hand, and I'm an agnostic on this, I think there are arguments both sides. There's actually a case to be made for anti-neutrality. For one thing, the qualities of the explanandum ought to influence the explanans. That is to say, what I want to explain ought to inform my explanation. If I wanted to explain why Francis Collins thinks that he's Napoleon, the falsity of that belief would influence my explanation. And so if people believe in the context of religion demonstrably false things, those ought to generate a different kind of explanation. So that's an argument for anti-neutrality. And furthermore, the very fictitiousness of some beliefs ends up not just being explained, but it ends up being part of the explanation. For example, some costly signaling versions of religion, and I'll get to that in just a minute, say the very fact that some religious beliefs are preposterous, are completely marginal in terms of mainstream culture, function very much like some behaviors, like circumcision, function as an emblem of identity in a particular believing community. So those are arguments for anti-neutrality. I would say if you go that route, would it cut both ways? That is to say, if the fictitiousness of religious beliefs ends up being something that we end up explaining, are we open to the possibility that some religious beliefs are true? Now, these issues actually become very important when we're talking about religious beliefs in those religions that have traditions of a sacred history. So if there are religious beliefs in historical events, would arguments for or against the historical event ever having had happen figure into an explanation of belief? Or do we just assume that it never happened? I'm thinking now in the Christian tradition of the resurrection. Lastly, there are some who argue that, well, whether we should be neutral, whether we should not be neutral, the fact is that although we're claiming to be neutral, it's actually not neutral from the start. Then it says, in order to explain the hold that various religious ideas and practices have on people, we need to understand the evolution of the human mind. Well, in one sense, I think that's true. But what Dennett and what this project involves, and what virtually all the evolutionary students of religion involves, is that the evolution of the human mind would provide a sufficient explanation for why people have religious beliefs. By the way, we wouldn't make that claim, again, of other kinds of beliefs. In order to explain why differential equations have such a hold on the human mind, we need to explain its evolution. Well, maybe. I think it is an interesting question, how the ability for complex mathematical reasoning involved. But that doesn't do very much toward understanding why differential equations, why we heard yesterday that they were found both true and beautiful. Explain why they have a hold. In fact, in order to understand why they have a hold, we need to understand differential equations. Okay. Now, one last quick comment, and I'm not going to belabor this one, but if we're studying religion, we need to have some sense of what it is we're studying. This is a huge field in and of itself, and a debated field, but I do want to point out that actually the different traditions of evolutionary approaches to religion start with different definitions of religion. So the famous Yale ecologist G. Evelyn Hutchinson said once, the most important decision an ecologist ever makes is where to get out of the car. What he means, of course, is by your study system, it is very influential in the results that you obtain, and how we define religion turns out to be very important in the explanation of religion that emerges out of that study. And it so happens that there are three main traditions in evolutionary approaches to religion, which I'm going to begin to describe in about 30 seconds. But one of them is the evolutionary cognitive science tradition, and that starts with a definition something like Tyler's over a century-old definition, minimum definition of religion, belief in spiritual beings. So it's a cognitive definition that involves belief in non-material or transcendent entities. On the other hand, the adaptationist tradition, championed by David Sloan Wilson, has a sociological definition of religion, something along the lines of Clifford Gertz's. A religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence. And lastly, the last tradition of explanation, Dan Dennett's and Richard Dawkins' favorite approach, is mimetics. And they start, actually, Dennett has a more ecumenical definition of religion, but here's Dawkins' definition. Faith is belief in spite of, or even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. Now, what definition you start with is, of course, going to influence your explanation. Skip this. Okay. Well, now, the title of Dennis's talk that he gave was, Can Biology Explain Religion? The biological landscape of explanations for religion is extraordinarily broad, ranging in scale from genetic to neurological to cognitive to social explanations. And then in depth from proximal to ultimate explanations, that is to say, explanations of immediate causation to explanations of ultimate origin. And the evolutionary explanations occupy this corner right now. They're ultimate explanations of the origin or function of something in the cognitive and social domains. At least right now, that's where the field is, and that's what I want to focus on. And there are three main traditions. Here we go. The first tradition is the cognitive spandrel tradition. And the cognitive spandrel tradition argues that religion is biological, or at least the inclination for human beings to believe in religious concepts. But it's a byproduct of other cognitive capacities that are adaptations. Religious belief itself is not an adaptation at all. It's not good for anything. It may be bad, even. Now, there are a number of different accounts. One of them is that it's in emotional compensation for loss of a parent figure. That would be Freudian, but there's some new theorists in this domain. Or the fear of death. These are religious belief is a byproduct of these other cognitive mechanisms. Or it's a byproduct of analogous to obsessive compulsive order, that especially religious rituals are exaggerations or hypertrophic manifestations of ritualized or repetitive harm avoidance procedures. Or the most prominent view that has received the most attention is that it ensues from a fundamental human capacity to detect agents, our agency detection device. And in the cases of religious belief, that detection device is hyperactive. Now, this term, HADD, hyperactive agency detection device, is actually generated by Justin Barrett, who's a Christian, an evangelical Christian actually, at Oxford right now. So these ideas aren't necessarily anti-religious, and they're ecumenical in terms of who espouses them. The notion of this is that all of us have an agency detection device. We have an intuitive physics very early in life, within the first 6 months or so. Children can anticipate the movement of physical objects, and that we appear to have an intuitive agency detecting device. Very, very early in life, human infants can detect the differences between animate and inanimate objects. And these agency concepts appear to be robust. They are biased toward the attribution of false positives. And oftentimes, especially early in life, we imbue agents with magnified qualities, immortality or omniscience. And there's a number of interesting experiments. For example, it's very easy to get people to respond to computerized dots, especially infants, but even humans, adults in video games, as if they're intelligent agents. And 5 months old can discriminate between chases and random movement. 9-month-olds can tell when the chaser becomes the chasee. And adults describe these events by attributing beliefs, desires, and sometimes gender to the objects. I grew up in the era where the first computer games just had dots. And there's developmental support, and I want to thank Justin Barrett for these slides, by the way, for a super-knowing God. Children evaluated knowledge of the contents of a closed box, and 3-year-olds assumed that everybody knew what was in the box: mother, God, bear, elephant, snake, and trees. By the time they were 5, only God knew what was in the box. But what's interesting here is the imputation of omniscience appears to be very early and innately intuitive. These children weren't taught that trees knew what was in a closed box. But there appears to be a winnowing over time. And same with omniperceptual ability. So children evaluated abilities to see in darkness. At 3, everybody could see. God, Maggie, monkey, kitty, but by 6, only God and the kitty could see what was in the box. Another set of experiments, by the way, children were shown a snake and a mouse. They saw a video of a snake eating a mouse. Then they put a snake in a box with snake food. And they were told that the snake is eating the snake food. And they were asked after a suitable amount of time elapsed, is the snake still there? Yes. Did the snake eat the food? Yes. Is the food still there? No. Then they did the same experiment with a snake and a mouse after they had seen the movie. And they were told the snake ate the mouse. And they were asked, is the snake still there? Yes. Did the snake eat the mouse? Yes. Is the mouse still there? Yes. So it looks like there are innate and intuitive mechanisms for detecting agents, for overly attributing them, and for attributing to them magnified qualities of agency that are innate. And what do we want to say about this? Well, first of all, this is one area where the empirical evidence does look to be very good, that there are innate mechanisms of agency detection. And in some respects, but the evidence, empirical evidence, actually isn't very good that these are byproducts of other cognitive capacities that have been selected for versus products. That is to say, right now, the empirical evidence is good for the innateness of agent concepts. But we need more data to decide whether they're spandrels and byproducts or whether they have selective value. Now, I would say that there's a scientific problem which has been described as the Mickey Mouse problem going on here. While this does describe the human ability to rather promiscuously generate agents, it doesn't describe why these agents should be imbued with religious significance. Maybe I should have said Mighty Mouse problem, because the agents have magnified qualities, but the one aspect of religious agents is that they have a sacred quality. And in most religions, although not all, that sacred quality is bound up with moral goodness. So these explanations don't explain that at all. Nor do they explain the fact that if these are spandrels, if they're byproducts, why do they exact such high costs in religious communities? If it were one of the interesting things about religious concepts is they wield tremendous influence over human behavior and priorities. The religious implications, well, there have been some attempts to exploit these ideas for natural theology. For example, some people have argued because natural selection, in order for a belief inclination to become innate, it should be accurate. And so there have been, both in the evolutionary theories of morality and religion, there have been attempts to argue from this toward moral or religious realism here. I actually think that's ill-advised. It's not, first of all, not clear that beliefs actually have to be accurate. They just have to motivate behaviors which are adaptive. And sometimes cognitive distortions can actually motivate adaptive behaviors. Now, what we might say, this doesn't prove the existence of God, but the innateness of religious inclinations is concordant with at least biblical views that some measure of knowledge of the transcendent is innate. Theologians might call that common grace. So there's a concordance here, but there's certainly not a demonstration. And on the other hand, there have been attempts at the reverse, natural atheology, to argue that because these attribution mechanisms are hyperactive, that religious beliefs are unreliable. Now, there's a couple of problems with trying to go this direction. First of all, we don't really know how hyperactive they are. That assumes that the entities believed in don't really exist. Now, maybe they're inaccurate, but inaccurate isn't the same as false positives. There may be a transcendent supernatural reality out there, and the intuitive sense that it is there is in fact quite accurate, but we see through a glass darkly. The second problem, though, with this is that while these mechanisms may contribute to religious belief, they're certainly not sufficient. Religion isn't simply an outgrowth of hyperactive agency detection. First of all, I've already mentioned that a key feature of religion, belief in the sacred quality of these agents, doesn't have anything to do with this. But secondly, and actually here the empirical data itself figures in, what we know is over the course of an individual life, people become progressively less promiscuous about the agents that they attribute. In fact, the suggestions of our agent detection are always being subjected to empirical assessment and rational analysis. And we are ever in the process of winnowing beliefs. Now that's true over the course of a human lifetime, but it's also true over the course of religious history. So if you look at the course of the history of religions, the entities, the supernatural entities being attributed, have become more parsimonious. So there's something more going on here than just HADD. Okay. Some time ago in The Atlantic, Yale psychologist Paul Bloom had an article called "Is God an Accident?" And just a few months ago, we had an article in Science. And Paul is himself an atheist, very gracious conversation partner with people of religious beliefs. But Paul's refrain is he wants to explain why children believe in God. And he believes it's due to these innate mechanisms. And I have asked Paul, the question I want to explain is not why children believe in God, but why adolescents wish their parents didn't believe in God. I'm being a little facetious here, but again, the issue to explain here is even if these beliefs are intuitive, why do they command such behavioral allegiance and investment? And here's where the second idea comes up in evolutionary theory. It involves adaptationist accounts of religion. Adaptationist accounts are actually pretty straightforward. There are a number of different kinds of them, but the most prominent version receiving attention is that religion is a uniquely human adaptive solution to a fundamental challenge of human organismal function, cooperation. And there are two challenges. In any cooperating system, at any scale, by the way, whether it's genes cooperating with each other in a genome, cells in a multicellular organism, individuals in a small population, or even large economic systems, you have to have cooperative coordination. The different participants have to know how to interact with each other, and you have to control defection, whether it's a selfish gene or a cancer cell, or in a cooperative system, an organism that defects or cheats. So here's a simple cooperative system, a cleaner RAS on a spotted grouper. Defection for the RAS would be, in addition to nibbling some of the fungus off of the gums, actually taking some of the protein tissue from the gum of the fish itself. How do we control for cheats or defectors? I suspect that you've all seen the prisoner's dilemma before. This is a situation in which both participants do best if they cooperate, but it turns out that each individual will do best if they defect, no matter what the other individual does. That's called the Nash equilibrium, so the system is driven to defection. Now one way, that's a problem in cooperative systems. One solution is policing or punishment. Now actual prisoner's dilemma in prisons is very seriously policed. And if you're a rat in prison, you get seriously punished. And in fact, in a paper in Nature a while back, the game theorist Ernst Fair demonstrated that in simple human cooperative economic games, punishment actually dramatically increases cooperation. But this raises a question of defection on punishers. Punishment costs as well. And then just a few weeks ago, there's a paper in Science that talked about the infinite regress problem of secondary defectors. Well, here's where a suggestion comes in for religion. It suggests that the way to control this problem is the cognitive internalization of punishment through belief in supernatural or cosmic sanctions, heaven or hell or karma. The benefit of this is, first of all, nobody has to pay the cost of punishment. That's God's business. And secondly, punishment, even if you're willing to pay the cost, can only be as effective as your ability to detect the cheats. But if punishment is internalized, every cheater is self-detecting. It would look something like this. If you defect when somebody defects on you, you're going to hell. And in fact, mutual cooperation becomes the Nash equilibrium. This seems almost comically overly simplistic, although this graph actually made it into the literature in a paper by Princeton game theorist Dominic Johnson. I would suggest that we can modify this a little bit for maybe a more Anglican or Catholic theology. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even tax collectors do the same. You've got to cooperate with those who defect. Then you get heaven and sainthood. We could also modify it for, Americans have taken the heat here at this conference, but let's imagine a kind of a mean-spirited American fundamentalist. Now, there actually is some data to suggest from the anthropologist Richard Sosis. He did a long-term a study of the long-term viability of religious communes. He had to throw out the Hutterites because they were so long-lived that they skewed the data. But even without the Hutterites, religious communities live much longer than non-religious communities. But the problem here is that you get tertiary defectors. That is to say, you get people who don't believe in cosmic sanctions. In the U.S., we're calling them brights, at Dan Dennett's suggestion. The solution to this is behavioral displays or costly practices. This is an old sociological theory of religion that's now being given game theoretic significance. It can be circumcision or tithing or dressing a certain way. Any display that is costly in terms of time, energy, or money, that marks your authentic commitment to a religious community. And by the way, Sosis followed up on the data that I just showed you, and he went back and looked at the longevity of communities as a function of the number of costly requirements. So there's some very interesting work going on here, although I should say that Sosis's is the only work that actually distinguishes the longevity of communities, religious versus non-religion. The rest of it is either entirely theoretical or it doesn't have much to do with religion. Now, a quick comment on assessment here. First of all, there's a big debate in evolutionary theory in general, but in particular in evolutionary accounts right now, between the adaptationists and the non-adaptationists. And in many respects, it's quite heated and even personally filled with animosity. I think it's a red herring, because if we look even at a simple trait like sickle cell anemia, I mean, that's a difference in just at one locus, one amino acid, right?
Right, one base pair.
And that trait, as simple as it is adaptive and non-adaptive depending on the environmental context. How much more would we expect a trait like religion, which is actually a symphony of traits? There are affective and behavioral and cognitive dispositions in religion with different capacities, different beliefs in different environments. I don't think it makes any sense at all to ask, is religion adaptive, as an either-or question. We ought to be asking, under what circumstances are certain forms of religion contribute to human flourishing, and under which circumstances don't they? So that's a red herring false dichotomy that I think a lot of careers are invested in, but doesn't make very much sense scientifically. I do want to make the distinction also between something being a biological adaptation versus a cultural innovation. So it could be, for example, that religion does contribute to human flourishing demonstrably in many contexts. But that doesn't suggest any evolutionary account of religion at all. So does the technology that Francis was talking about the other day. That contributes to human flourishing. But I actually don't want an evolutionary theory of genetic technology. What we want there is a cultural theory of the development of technological innovation. So the fact that something may be an innovation contributing to human flourishing doesn't even suggest an evolutionary account in and of itself. And lastly, I want to point out the difference between religion being adaptive and human institutions in general being adaptive. So one of the leading workers in this field is David Sloan Wilson, and he has a long book called Darwin's Cathedral, in which he does several case studies of religions in different cultures and makes the case that they're adaptive. The problem is, the attributes which he suggests are adaptive in these religions, well actually there are two problems. One problem is they may be adaptive culturally. That is to say, they may contribute to the longevity of cultures. But actually, evolution isn't concerned with explaining that. Evolution is concerned with explaining reproductive fitness. And David doesn't make the link between cultural flourishing and reproductive fitness. It's just not there. But the second problem is all the attributes that contribute to cultural integrity or function are true of every other stable cultural institution. They're true of bowling clubs, they're true of baseball teams, they're true of the Audubon Society. So it's not clear that these theories yet have a grasp on the qualities of religious life that makes it religious. And right now there's a big disjunct between the theory that I described earlier, which is a very attractive theory, this notion of the internalization of cosmic sanctions. But nobody's actually studied that. What's been studied are completely different kinds of things. So we really don't know. And lastly, there's the anomaly of religious altruism. And Wilson himself says that the one thing my theory can't explain is why people would make radical, fitness-relinquishing sacrifices for people outside the unit of social functionality. Now, by the way, it can explain radical relinquishment within the context of the social unit. So, religiously motivated people flying planes into buildings are potential candidates for being made sense of by this theory, but not people, prisoners fleeing their warden, giving their lives for the warden. And Wilson himself says this is one aspect of his approach to these issues that remains unexplained, the aspect of radical religious altruism. And that brings up, and we're on the home stretch here, the last current approach to religion, viewing it as a mimetic contagion. Meme theory is simply, and this is an interesting area of theorizing these days because it's the first time in 150 years that biologists, by data, have been driven to suggest, at least some biologists, that there are inputs, substantial inputs into human behavior that are non-biological. For 150 years, the materialistic bias of the natural sciences have argued that ideas are consequences, consequences of the material processes going on inside of organisms. Now there's been a return to the notion that ideas have consequences. The basic proposal is that we have dual inherence. Now right now this is being proposed for humans and only humans, that we have genetic inputs and we have cultural informational inputs into human behavior, and the cultural informational inputs are sufficient to break what E.O. Wilson has called the genetic leash on human behavior. Memes can subvert genetic self-interest, and I'll say more about this in the afternoon. So Joseph Lopredo, for example, says conceptions of a cultural nature that thwart the self-serving thrust of the gene, the sole principle among them, and he has in mind this, by this, the notion of religious transcendence, can be thought of as the kernel of an internalized morality reinforced by fictitious forces, whereby some humans are led to subordinate their genetic fitness and their self-interest in general to the fitness of others. By the way, this almost sounds like Jesus, you'll know the truth and the truth shall set you free, except in Lopredo's view, it's not the truth, it's a fiction. But nevertheless, it's a tremendously powerful ideational fiction. Now lastly, is the conclusion by the most recent and most prominent advocates of meme theory that religious faith, what kind of a meme is it? Well, it's a viral or pathological meme. Dawkins says faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox but more difficult to eradicate. And the patient who is inflicted with this typically finds himself impelled by some deep inner conviction that something is true or right or virtuous. We doctors refer to such a belief as faith. So in Dawkins' view, actually, faith is a disease, and scientists are the people that have the tools to cure the disease. Now, how do we want to assess these ideas? I mean, this would be a seminar in and of itself, but I really am going to honor the time commitment. First of all, I do want to point out that there is in memetics a unique affirmation of biological transcendence, and maybe a naive one. So Dennett himself, who favors memetics, says we have built-in desires to reproduce and do pretty much whatever it takes to achieve this goal. But we also have creeds and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. He wouldn't say this for any other organism. This fact does make us different. Dennett says we have the power to defy the selfish genes of our birth, something that has no place in nature, something that has never existed before in the whole history of the world. These are radical affirmations of human distinction and uniqueness. I actually think they're too radical. And they're almost Gnostic in the sense that they uncouple what it is that is most unique about humans from the embodiment of human psychology. But I also need to point out that all of these things constitute an acknowledgement of the inability of genetic reductionism to explain behavior, but they are not themselves an explanation. there's no proposal for how it is that memes exert this causal efficacy on human behavior. In fact, if I was to suggest that there were certain entities that existed that were not reducible to material entities, that could infect your brain or inhabit your mind and make you do things that were contrary to your biological disposition, would I be talking about memes or demons? It's actually not clear. Now, memetics may prove to be a fruitful discipline, but it hasn't yielded any fruit yet after 30 years. And it's not even clear that it's, by the definition I gave earlier, as observable regularities and testable causal accounts, it's not even clear that it's a naturalistic proposal. This isn't a religious objection. There's tremendous debate in the scientific community about the viability of memetics. But the interesting thing is, it is the only position, aside from a metaphysical position, a philosophical simple affirmation of human free will. I mean, we could just do that. We could just say humans have free will. The value of memetics is that it enables the clear observation that humans' behavior is not constrained on a reproductively enhancing genetic leash. It enables it still to fall within the Darwinian paradigm, because the Darwinian paradigm of differential transmission can also be explained to memes. Just as an organism is a gene's way of reproducing itself, so is it claimed that a meme is a mind's way of reproducing itself. But that leaves completely, all of that leaves completely unexamined the question of if there are memes, whether they're parasitic or whether they're beneficent. And by the way, here, not Dawkins, and I don't mean to be taking swipes, but I just think this is true at face value. There's some serious incoherence here on two fronts. First of all, he actually doesn't systematically marshal data to argue that religion is pathogenic. It's tremendously anecdotal, no less so than creationism appears to mine the sciences only for those facts that contribute to their point of view. But it's also internally inconsistent. Earlier I had told you that he affirms the unique human capacity for altruism, which he thinks is a good thing. But altruism is actually contrary to human genetic flourishing. So it's not clear why Dawkins affirms that, and why, by the same token, he views religion as pathogenic. So to conclude, some brief concluding comments. I would say that all of these approaches that I just outlined for you, and right now they really are embattled theoretical communities. I think we have a need for all of them. They all bring something to the table. Neither of them are sufficient by themselves, and right now it doesn't appear that we have an entirely sufficient explanation of religion either. All of them have possibilities for consilience. So the cognitive aspect is consonant with religious belief in terms of its suggesting that there's some innate disposition to recognizing the transcendent. The adaptationist paradigm is consonant to the extent that it suggests that who humans are built to flourish with religious commitments. And the mimetic has something to contribute as well in suggesting that ultimately ideas have consequences, and religious beliefs and many other kinds of beliefs are not reducible to Darwinian principles. And lastly, and I told you I would get here, does in fact providing a functional explanation subvert the viability of religious belief? There are two ways it could do this. It could challenge the truth of beliefs, like Kai Nielsen suggested earlier. I have not seen a single argument for this. How it is that providing a functional explanation for belief in something subverts the truth of what it is that you're believing in. But there are a number of arguments that suggest that it subverts our warrant for confidence in the truth. So Alex Rosenberg, in a recent essay in Biology and Philosophy called Darwin's Nihilistic Idea, says the Darwinian explanation becomes the Darwinian nihilist explaining away when it becomes apparent that the best explanation, blind variation and natural selection, for the emergence of our ethical belief does not require these beliefs to have truth markers. If our best theory of why people believe P does not require that P is true, then there are no grounds to believe P is true. Richard Joyce puts it this way: if you believe that Napoleon lost Waterloo, but you find later that when you were a baby you had been given a pill that causes anybody who takes that pill to believe that Napoleon lost Waterloo, it doesn't mean that he won, but it should subvert your confidence that the belief is true. And in close, I would just like to suggest, I think these are criticisms that deserve to be taken seriously. Now, Francis said the other day that he believes that properly understood, the sciences and religious belief, if there is a God who made the world, can't ultimately conflict. But we do have partial understanding, and it doesn't mean that there aren't genuine challenges that the natural sciences or any other field of inquiry can raise. This is a legitimate challenge. I would say at this point it doesn't look to be definitive. First of all, Rosenberg says if our best explanation doesn't require, well, it's not clear that right now natural selection accounts for religious belief are our best explanation. I think there's promise here of explaining some aspects. Right now it may look like it could explain the capacity for religious belief, but that's like explaining the capacity for mathematical belief. It doesn't actually say anything about warrant for belief in the truth of a particular proposition. Which, that's my point right there. Secondly, there's kind of a circularity here, isn't there? We began by noting that the method that we're going to use to explain religious belief would not use the beliefs themselves in an account of that method. Now Rosenberg says, by the way, if we can give an account of belief itself that doesn't use the belief in an account of holding the belief, then you shouldn't hold the belief. But we already started by ruling out accounts of the belief that use the belief. So there's a little bit of a methodological circularity. And finally, back to the idea of the pill. There are some kinds of beliefs which have as a precondition for the belief the truth of the belief. The Napoleon pill, what if I could demonstrate that the pill itself that caused me to believe in Napoleon, that Napoleon lost Waterloo, was concocted or invented by Napoleon when he was in exile on Elba. Then the fact that I believed in Napoleon would be due to the pill. But the pill came from Napoleon. So in order for Rosenberg's challenge to work, we would actually have to explain the origin of human cognition and humans, and the situations that gave rise to life, and the fact that there is something rather than nothing, all the way down. Now, I don't want to go the other way. I don't want to try to use those things to prove God. But I do want to say that right now we don't have an explanation all the way down. So it's a challenge that needs to be taken seriously, but isn't definitive. And lastly, well, what would it mean to have warranted faith? Well, I want to argue that it would take both evidence, but also, and Francis quoted Hebrews yesterday, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. But it also takes a kind of assurance that is not contrary to the evidence, but is not wholly evidentially determined. This maybe get back to those notions. Alplanico calls these properly basic beliefs. Pascal says the heart has reasons that reason knows not. It is not to suggest that reason should fly in the face of evidence, and that heart reason should fly in the face of rationality. It is to suggest that ultimately warrant is a larger question. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I think we're going to have time just for a couple of questions now. We do have Jeff again this afternoon, so we're going to have some more time for questions there. But we have time for just one or two quick questions. One at the back, did it?
The human species has apparently been around for a handful of thousands of years, and the evolutionary mechanism, as I understand Simon talking to us, is mindlessly in the business of generating lots and lots of variations, and in the process you get frozen accidents and the after effects of random directions. And here we are looking for an evolutionary explanation for faith and belief in things that is being presumably tried out selectively in all sorts of different ways. Given that paradigm, how is it meaningfully possible to distinguish between any of this range of ideas, and to want to pick on any one of them and say that it's a better explanation than any of the others? Surely the point is it's a work in progress and we can't possibly evaluate it.
Could you say one more sentence? I'm not quite sure what.
What's the falsifiability? How would you falsify any of these rival ideas? What kind of data would falsify them? If I could put a question there. Yeah.
Speak now.
Yes, that's right. You can. It'll pick it up for you. That's okay.
There's a microphone you can hold there.
There's a microphone.
Oh, okay.
right
You
here.
could. Sorry.
Just hover
Hold
around.
it in your hand, maybe. Yes. Yeah.
Well,
It's okay.
There's a sliding switch that needs to get up.
it depends on the idea, actually. Right now, I don't think the last proposal, memetics, is framed in a way that does make it falsifiable. There, in fact, is not an operational definition of a meme. We don't have a way to study mimetic transmission. Right now, memetics is a post hoc hypothesis that has been generated to explain, and this is how science works, by the way. This is actually really fun. Gene-centric Darwinism made some predictions about the range of animal and human behavior that turns out to have been controverted by the data. Humans in particular do all sorts of things that we wouldn't be expected to do if our behavior were wholly ascribable to genes filtered through natural selection. So when scientists encounter anomalies, they generate post hoc hypotheses. It's not always clear how we test those hypotheses. So you could, in planetary motion, we anticipated the existence of planets before we had the technology to discover them. Right now, we really don't have a way to test memetics. It's a little bit hard for me to imagine a way to test them. So that's one side of things. On the other hand, the cognitive theories, well, I actually think they have been very well tested. There's a rich body of empirical work on the innateness of agency concepts, and it's growing. What there isn't in that work is actual empirical studies of the roots of those abilities. Are they byproducts or are they products? That's a little bit harder to test. Now, it might be, let me build a bridge to Francis's presentation. I mean, maybe we're going to discover genetic components to these dispositions. For selection to work, by the way, something has to not only be heritable, but there has to be heritable variance for selection to work. So that would be important. But the last question of the adaptationist versus the spandrel or non-adaptationist, that's a really thorny question. That's a thorny question for any human behavioral trait, just because ultimately what it means for something to be adaptive is that it results in babies. And it's very hard to measure that over long periods of time. And secondly, humans aren't baby optimizing to begin with. So in modern cultures, there's been a dramatic reduction in fertility. It's simply not, it's not clear how we measure the fitness contributing component of human behavior. So I'm sorry for the rambling answer, but I think the testability of these different propositions is itself varied.
Thanks. I think really we've got lunch coming up in 10 minutes. I think we're going to have to break there. And thanks, Jeff, very much indeed for getting some time.